Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Enno.
I'll
Thank you.
share
And
screen.
thanks for inviting us. Thanks for inviting us to the symposium. So my name's Neil McCutcheon, and I work for ELTeach, which offers CELTA, pre-CELTA and post-CELTA courses online.
And I'm Neil Anderson. I'm head of training at Euroexam International, which is based in Budapest in Hungary, where Neil and I originally met many years ago.
So we're going to tell you something about taking task-based learning online. First, a little introduction. How we got interested in task-based learning was that we were working together, as Neil says, in International House in Budapest. And task-based learning was one of the frameworks that we used to offer to our DELTA trainees as an alternative to more traditional CELTA style teaching. We felt as the years went on, we felt because of what our trainees asked that there was a kind of lack of go-to material for task-based learning. That's why we wrote the book, to provide some tasks that were easily accessible. And then last year, because of the pandemic, we suddenly found ourselves, like a lot of you probably, with a lot of time on our hands. And that's why we started the Fluency First blog, in case people wanted to take tasks and do them online on a platform like Zoom. So our plan today is to tell you something about the benefits of task-based learning, and to tell you about the characteristics of a task, different types of task, and then we're going to show you how EdTech can support the tasks when you're doing them on Zoom. So we have a couple of example tasks towards the end. Neil, if you could just move the frame. Thank you. So this is an introduction to task-based learning. Probably many of you have some acquaintance with this, especially with some of the things in the previous talk that Joe was talking about. Like I see that a lot of learning is activity-based, and this is the essence of task-based learning. It's actually getting students to do something with language. So it's a very communicative framework, and that's the first thing that it has to recommend it. The lessons are based around tasks, and these become the centerpiece of the lesson, not, as you might see, freer practice relegated to the end of the lesson, but they're upfront and they tend to come early in the lesson. Task-based learning is well supported by second language acquisition theory. Students learn by communicating, they learn by being exposed to a lot of language. Probably the explicit teaching of grammar and vocabulary, while there's definitely a role for that, probably it's less important than we think, because students are following a kind of internal syllabus, if you like, and teaching can't really do much to influence the order of learning there. So in task-based learning, the teaching part is reactive. So what language do students need to do the task? It's our role to supply that or to upgrade their language and to help them say things better. Task-based learning is also authentic in at least a couple of ways. We can expose the students to authentic texts as part of the task, and also the tasks themselves can be genuinely communicative situations, or they can mimic everyday communicative situations in the classroom. The teaching part in task-based learning is called focus on form. So that's rather technical, but it really just means clarification of language. In task-based learning, it tends to come later in the lesson. So it's reactive, as I've said. It comes after the task itself. And one thing about focus on form is it tends to be rich. So rather than this kind of caricatured structure of the day approach that you might find in traditional textbooks, task-based learning can include vocabulary, structures, pronunciation, all sorts of little devices to help students engage in discourse and do the tasks. And finally, in task-based learning, it's good and it's part of the approach to repeat the task later in the lesson or in subsequent lessons, and research has shown that this results typically in gains in fluency, as you'd expect, and in accuracy. I'm going to show you a couple of quotations that I like just to sum this up, both from Dave Willis, one of the originators of task-based learning in the 90s. I'll let you read this one. So this is self-explanatory, that, well, we can't control students' language development. So, you know, we let their language develop in its own way and we meet them at the point of need. So, you know, I very much like that idea of giving up control. And one more quotation. I'll let you read that one. So much like the way we learn our first language, I suppose, the idea is that this is a fluency-led or a fluency-fronted approach. The accuracy comes later. It's honed by the communication process and the teacher's feedback on that. So we're using language to learn it rather than learning language in order to use it and generate sentences that the teacher wants to see. So it's turning the traditional methodology on its head. I should say that we're not evangelists for task-based learning. We think it's a worthwhile approach if you believe in communicative language teaching, but we think it's one approach among many different ones, and we think it's well worth exploring, but we're not suggesting in any way that you throw out what you normally do. I'll hand over to you, Neil.
Thanks, Neil. And I like the image of, or the description of us as not being evangelists, because one thing I want to say is that TBL or TBLT is a broad church. There are many different versions, stronger and deeper end ones and shallower or weaker ones. Maybe one of the most famous of the deep end versions is Mike Long's, which is one of the most comprehensive and meticulous. And he poses that a task needs to be derived from real life needs, done through needs analysis by needs analysis experts. The question is whether everyone is able to do that. So there are questions of authenticity that Neil mentioned, and I think for us, it's enough, as with other practitioners such as Willis, it's enough for a task to be some sort of active discourse that's analogous to real life. It doesn't necessarily need to be based upon a target need as such. For example, debating an issue or giving opinions. Anyway, regardless of the broad church, there are definitely some agreed characteristics as to what a task is, and it's worth looking at these briefly. So, a task has its primary focus on meaning, not form. It's not about display use of language, but using the language that the students have at their disposal and indeed pushing this, doing something with language rather than displaying something for the teacher. So it's very much about their own linguistic resources and using these. And in doing so, there is some form of goal or outcome to be achieved. Something meaningful, like agreeing on 5 things, solving a problem, sharing, comparing experiences. And that's typically based upon a gap of some sort. There's a space between the interlocutors, and they're working to bridge this gap through communication. Okay, so keeping these characteristics in mind, let's look at sort of 2 versions of a typical classroom activity, general English at least. Sort of, what are you going to do this weekend? What are your weekend plans? have a look at them and decide which one you think seems to fulfill these criteria, these characteristics, and which one falls short. So version A. Version B. Okay, hopefully you agree that version A seems to fall short because it appears to be designed in order to encourage the students to display use of a specific linguistic form. In other words, the goal of the activity, if there is one, is to use be going to, rather than to communicate some form of meaning. Whereas for B, it seems to be more meaningful, and the goal doesn't seem to be about display or conformist use of language, but rather is about achieving something with your peers, i.e. planning a weekend, deciding what the itinerary should be or the agenda, and then basically agreeing on it. Okay. Just to give some examples, I mean, there's any number of ways of taxonomizing tasks. And I think broadly speaking, we follow Willis here. And it's worth doing so because our book is largely arranged around this. You'll notice there's overlap between task types. The key is for the activity to be meaningful. So a number of tasks could involve listing or ranking, such as one that you'll see later when you list and agree or disagree on your most hated domestic chores. Problem solving, for instance, getting together to try to decide how to allocate money that you've won to improve facilities at your school or at your company, and so on and so forth. Opinion gaps are absolutely central to task-based learning. For instance, planning an ideal meal that shows off your country's cuisine. So seeing if you can agree or disagree on what dishes to include. And of course, information gaps such as jigsaw reading or other type tasks. Perhaps you might get your students to read 4 or 5 different news stories. Then they get together, share them, and decide which one of the news stories is fake news and not real. Something as simple as sharing experience is fundamental to task-based learning. I mean, this is a fundamental part of human discourse. For instance, discussing your holidays when you were a kid and just naturally comparing and evaluating how similar or how different they were. Creative tasks for your more creative learners. For instance, perhaps you play them a soundtrack from YouTube, and then based upon prompts or some form of worksheet, they devise the movie that the soundtrack comes from. And this can be done with various soundtracks so that they come together and present the different movies they've created. Okay, so that's just a summary of a taxonomy of task types. I think, Neil, we'll now move on to briefly look at the task cycle. But just before we do, a reminder that the key characteristic that we're emphasizing here is that your lesson is centered around the task and its completion, not the use of a particular form. Whatever forms come up to serve the task, fine, but it's not about showing that you can use a particular linguistic item. Okay.
All right. I'm going to tell you about the task cycle. Again, many of you may be familiar with this, but if you're new to task-based learning, then here's a simplified version of the original Willis cycle. We're quite flexible with the parts of the cycle. We don't necessarily do, each micro stage here, but it is a useful thing to have in mind as a good framework for lessons. The 3 main phases are important. So the pre-task cycle includes things that you would be familiar with, like raising students' interest, activating schemata, and pre-teaching vocabulary. One thing that can appear at this stage is a text. This could be an authentic text, perhaps an unscripted text. To perhaps a model of the task could be useful, or something else that will stimulate the communication later on. We believe that tasks are better if they do have a text in there somewhere. So the ones in the book tend to. The task itself is the centerpiece of the lesson, as I've said. Now, this should be done by the students more or less independently. So they're focusing on the goal, as Neil has said, they're focusing on the outcome, they're using their own resources. There can be some focus on language here, but it generally comes from the students. So this is called negotiation of meaning, or negotiation for meaning. This is when, you know, you say something and somebody frowns and they don't quite understand, and they have to, you know, reformulate it to make themselves understood. So that all happens at this stage. And sometimes students produce a written report to kind of formalize that stage, or we just have feedback. The language focus typically comes late as I've said, in a task-based lesson. So at this stage, the teacher can, in different ways, focus on the language that the students have generated or the language that they need, not just corrections, but upgrades. The recording or the model of proficient speakers doing the task can also appear at this stage, because it's quite useful for students to compare what they've done with the more proficient version, and that can make some of the language points salient for them. So those are the basics of the task cycle, and Neil's going to tell you about how we would use EdTech to support these stages.
Yeah, now I think it's probably important to point out at this stage that you shouldn't be preparing, you know, to have your minds blown by the tech that we use. You know, 2 years ago, if I thought I was going to be giving some form of plenary at an Ed Tech Symposium, I would have thought, you know, that's a crazy idea. But we basically just found the core tools that are very, very useful for us in terms of implementing this framework, this cycle, in a way that's effective online. And we know, I mean, I'm sure you know from your experience, that teaching online can in many cases make communication quite difficult. You know, the sense of lag, of distance, detachment, poor technology, learners whose cameras are off, and so on and so forth. So there can be, or many of us have experienced these kind of issues. So the basic tools that we use will be completely familiar to all of you. Really, I think the value here is in us showing how we apply them to this sort of pedagogical principled sequence. So here we go. My favorite. Okay, no doubt you'll recognize what all of these are. You'll certainly recognize the one on the top right. I'd just like to talk you through briefly how we integrate these, or one way of integrating these into the task sequence, essentially. So first of all, on the top left, we can see Jamboard, Google Jamboard, and we'll be demonstrating, as Neil mentioned, a couple of examples shortly. And it's an ideal tool as an interactive collaborative whiteboard, essentially. It's an ideal tool for many of the things that one would do in the pre-task and the task phases of the cycle, whether that's generating ideas, brainstorming, because you're using, for instance, sticky notes. Learners have this tangible thing in front of them that allows them to negotiate meaning as they decide on ideas, move them around, order and rank them, and so on and so forth, categorize them, etc., relevant to the task. Jamboard's also ideal, as we'll see in the examples, for using frames to set up the instructions and parameters for a task. We know for online teaching that the instructions can get lost easily, and so I feel quite strongly that a visual element to instructions is fundamental. Some tasks can be rather complex. They have more than one step. So having it on a frame that learners can return to once they're in their rooms to double check is of great value for facilitating the task. Top right, of course, we can see rooms which are, whether it breakout rooms using whatever platform, are essential, because for task-based learning, we need to create the space for learners to collaborate in smaller groups. And these, of course, give the teacher the opportunity to monitor discreetly. And as Neil mentioned, during the task, the teacher is probably not going to be doing a lot of language work, but it's actually, it's a good opportunity. Let me just go over to the chat on the bottom right. Yeah, it's a good opportunity to use the chat to feed in language, to teach at the point of need, and the learners can decide whether to look at that or not. So you can help them with language while they're online during the task in a discrete way using the chat, as well as gathering language to feed back on afterwards through Google Docs. Docs is ideal for collaborative preparation for tasks. And any task that involves a substantial amount of writing. Tasks are written as well as spoken, and therefore it's a very, very useful tool for it. Okay. So these are just some of the core sort of basic tools that I find myself using when I'm trying to implement our tasks online. And I think Jamboard is probably the key platform that I use the most for laying out tasks. Essentially. Okay, we're going to look at 2 or 3 examples. We'll certainly have time to look at 2, and we may have time to blitz through the 3rd, but we want to show you these 3 example tasks that we've got on Jamboard, okay? Here are their names. Domestic robot is one that came from our book. The National Banquet is one that I've come up with recently. I've not yet posted it on our blog. I will do after this conference. Post-pandemic travelers, that's been on our blog for a while. 3 different tasks. They scale up in terms of complexity, in terms of the steps involved, that is. So let's have a look at them. Neil,
so I'm doing the really simple
one, right? Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, can we see the Jamboard? Can you see it?
Yes,
Neil?
can see the Jamboard. Yes, I can see it. Yeah. Okay, so this task, some of you may know it, is a pyramid discussion. That's the kind of task where people think of things individually. Then there's a discussion in pairs, then with a larger group, and finally with the whole class. So that's the pyramid idea. You may be familiar with other versions like the Desert Island, famous Desert Island version from Klippel's book way back in time. So this is a version called Domestic Robot. And I'm going to try an experiment here. I need your help with it. So I will paste a link in the chat now, and please, I would like only the people who have their birthdays in July to open the link. So only the July birthdays. The rest of you, you can you'll have access to the link later.
Well, hoping from about 140 people, there should be some people born in July, right?
Yeah, so I'm thinking if your birthday is this month, you have to be honest. Then just click on the link. I'll give you a few seconds. Right. So I can see some people joining there. That's fantastic. July the 31st. Great. Yeah, you're in. Well done. Okay, here's my flat. Look at it. It's wonderful. It's spick and span and absolutely just 5 stars on Airbnb, right? Very clean flat. Can we just go back a frame, Neil? Because I see we're on room 1. If we could just, yeah, okay. So if those people, the July birthdays, if you could go to this frame, the first frame, I'd like you to think of some tasks, chores, not complicated things like writing your master's paper, but just simple, domestic chores that you don't like doing. So I've put ironing, for example, because that's one of my pet hates. It seems to be a waste of time. If you look on the right-hand side, sorry, the left-hand side, you'll see there's a panel if you haven't used Jamboard, and 4 items down, you'll find a sticky note. So please click on the sticky note and just write on 1 per sticky a chore that you don't like doing, and then press enter, and okay, you've got the idea. So I'll leave you a few seconds to do that.
Yeah, no surprise that ironing is a popular choice in this activity.
Yeah. I'll give you 30 more seconds. You've got to use your imagination here, right? Nobody's put cleaning the toilet yet.
There they have now.
There we are. Okay. Okay, you can just you can keep adding, and I'll just say something about Jamboard. So Jamboard, if you haven't used it before, it's rather easy to create these attractive backdrops. It's a matter of seconds. It's very easy to do. You can not only add these stickies, but you can also add images, and you can add text as well. So it's a fantastic visual focus point for the task. You can also take these things and you can arrange them, and you can make them larger and smaller. So it's like students coming to the whiteboard, but it's better in many ways. Somebody's writing, unless you've got naughty students.
Yeah, don't know whether to move on.
We'll move on in a minute. So anyway, this is a brainstorming sequence. This is the pre-task sequence. And then I tell students, okay, look, what have we here? This is the domestic robot. Okay. And I can bring him to the front. The government is issuing every household with a domestic robot who can do these tasks. So from the ones on the board, you decide which 10 programs, which 10 functions you would like the robot to have. And that's done individually. Okay, Neil, if you could show the next frame. Okay, so here comes the start of the task now. I'll put the students into different rooms, and they're going to do a bit of prioritization. I just want to show you something about the rooms now. So, and this took me weeks or maybe months to find this amazing feature of Jamboard that Neil's just about to show you. It looks obvious, but it's not. It's very, very small. So do you see that tiny arrow there, that tiny V-shaped arrow? That opens and closes your kind of control panel for the boards. So if I've made a room like this, room 1, I can just clone it and clone it and clone it, as many rooms as I want. And all I have to do is relabel each one, room 1, room 2, and so on. So, and then I can clone and delete to my heart's content. So, and again, this just takes seconds. So it's a fantastically easy to set up. Here's the task. Right now, the government's a bit short of money, so your robot is only going to come equipped to do 5 chores. But this time, you're not only with your, not in your flat, but you have to share this with your neighbor. So can you and your neighbor agree the top 5 most hated chores? And I'll give them a time limit, like 3 minutes, or, you know, as long as they perhaps allow them a bit more if they're really into the discussion. Tends to be quite generative. They can use the Jamboard. They can flip back to the original one for ideas. They can use the stickies. They can prioritize them, delete them, make them larger, sort them. It's just a fantastic resource. Afterwards, I'll bring them back to the main room. And without doing feedback, I'll set up the next stage. So Neil, if you could just flip forward a couple of frames.
Yeah, you want me to skip through all of the rooms, right?
Yeah, and that's it, there to there. Right, so I'm going to then recombine the students. You've all done this on Zoom, so I'll put them into. Ideally, it's great if you can put one pair with another pair. You know, if you've got 8 students or 16 students, that's fantastic. But combine the rooms now, and here's the new task. Government's a bit short of money because of the pandemic, so this time your robot only comes equipped, I'm afraid, with to do 3 things. So it's very basic model, and you have to share it not just with your neighbor, but with everybody on your floor of your block. Okay, so you 4 students, or however many, you have to agree the top 3 most hated chores. And again, I'll give them a time limit. With the time limits, you only get the number of things that you can agree on. So if you only agree on 2 tasks, the robot can only do 2 tasks. You know, you get the ones that you agree on, and that's it. So that forces the communication. And look how good Jamboard is here, better than face-to-face teaching, really, because it provides this, lovely visual focus, and they can work together with the stickies. Finally, we'll come back, and in the main class, we can just debate, the most hated one. Did anyone beat ironing, for example? Okay. And Neil's going to show us now just the simplest way to do language feedback is live in the chat. So things that the students need, you can alert them, you can tell them, have a look in the chat, here's how you can say this. I mean, this feedback could be during the task or later, and different people disagree when it should be. It's actually quite useful to drop in these pieces of language into the task itself, and you can look at them later too. They can be varied from more basic ones like I don't like ing to more idiomatic ones for higher levels. It's more of a burden than, and so on. So the language feedback will depend on you and the students. So that's domestic robots, and I'll hand over to you, Neil, for the next task.
But I think I find with that task in particular, I end up doing quite a lot of language feedback at the point of need. So while they're doing the task, because, with the chores and so on and so forth, they're not quite getting it right. And they're often asking, how do I say this? Make the dish. How is it? And so on. So a lot of it goes on while the task is happening, as well as refining it afterwards.
And of course, it's very good for comparatives.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Okay, we'll look at one more task, the national banquet. And here we can see an example of a Jamboard frame being used to give information and to contextualize the task. So it sets up the task and it gives the instructions that there's a very special guest coming to Hungary or whatever country as relevant to your teaching context. And in order to impress this special guest, you're gonna plan a banquet of some sort. And so on your own, it's staged. Learners, first of all, need to select a certain number of dishes, 3 starters, 3 main course, and so on. And ultimately, the main task is then going to come when they present these, negotiate, and try to choose the best 3 from all of their examples. So let's say they're in groups of 3. In theory, they've got 9 starters, 9 main courses. Of course, a number of them will overlap. And ultimately later, they'll present their banquet to other groups in order to vote for the most Hungarian. So it's a very sort of typical task based upon an opinion gap, based upon negotiation, using content that is schematically relevant to the learners. They can talk about their national cuisines. Obviously, this particular task is designed for monolingual classes, but it can be tweaked for multilingual classes. And as Neil was mentioning with Jamboard, one of the things that's nice about it is it's very, very easy just to arrange and set a background. I literally just went, okay, set background, let me find something online. I'll do a Google image search, and I typed in banquet, scrolled through a few, and then this came up as the background for it. So just as an attractive platform for what they do, which is when they now negotiate and discuss their choices and have to agree. And so they're going to end up with 3 items for each of these areas for their banquet. So this is how room 1 started. And this is how room 1 finished. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Hungarian cuisine. I know at least one person in the audience who is. Maybe there are more. Okay. So
I'll have some bull's blood.
Yeah, that's the wine. Yeah. So in other words, this is what one room has come up with, and then they're going to present their ideas to the other rooms, basically, and ultimately choose which one is the most Hungarian. Now, just to show you one other thing that I think is quite nice to do on Jamboard, because we know that groups don't necessarily work at the same pace, and some finish earlier than others. So I usually have some sort of hidden extra task there underneath a sticky note. So once they're ready, they could delete that sticky note and then come up with the extra things relevant for the task. So in this case, okay, you've designed and you've got your banquet. So what music are you going to come up with? What other entertainment is typical or relevant for your country? Okay, so it's quite nice to, and if I want to put the sticky note back, I'll just undo that action there. Basically, it's quite a nice feature that you can easily have these extra tasks for early finishers on Jamboard. Okay, and as with domestic robot, which we looked at before, I think this is a task where you can do a lot of the language feedback on the areas they need, so what they're trying to express during the task. But no doubt you'll identify a lot of language areas that emerge, that come up, that you can't really deal with during the task. So just to finish with an example of how one way that I deal with emergent language during a task-based sequence as we move towards the closing language focus part. Okay, can you see I've switched to Google Docs? Can you see that? Okay, I'm just going to enlarge it so we can see it properly. That's about as big as it'll get for now. It's very, one thing that I like doing is just to have a grid like this in Google Docs, something similar to this with a column for what I heard and what I'd probably say. So that's perhaps slightly more motivating than saying incorrect, correct, or something like that. But also it emphasizes the fact that it's not just, something might not necessarily be incorrect, but you might want to upgrade it or improve it given their level. So that's the generic grid, and an example, a couple of examples for domestic robot, national banquet. So the way I would do it is, okay, the examples of what I heard on the left from the students, do 1 or 2 together as a class to work with them. Okay, I don't think you mean strangers. Do you mean people who come from other countries? What do we call that? Okay, foreigners, and so on and so forth. How do we say potsol in English? Yes, tripe stew, and you're quite right. And also to illustrate the fact that okay, I'm not just correcting good idea, I really like it, but giving perhaps a more natural version. Now that's a great idea. So recasting and improving. And then I let the students get on with it in groups and collaborate and come up with their own ideas for their corrected versions of the sentences. And in the end, by the time we finish this, we should have a list of natural corrections for some of the things they were trying to say. So that's one way of doing language focus after the task, if you want to just deal with emergent language. Have a grid, make notes of areas that you hear that you want to work on, do a couple of examples, set the students to it, let them have a go, then help them further, correct them, and end up with some clear examples at the end. Okay, I'm just going to flip back to the PPT. Can you see it, Neil?
Yes.
You're muted.
I can see it. Just to finish off, here are some resources. So this is a copy of our book, Activities for Task-Based Learning. It's got, I think, about 40 tasks in there. A lot of them are supported by natural, unscripted text. So we actually interviewed people, got them to do the task or got them to do the introduction. So there's no grading of language there, other than, you know, they knew that they were talking to students. Also in the book, there for each task there are ideas for the language focus, different lexes, grammar, and all types of linguistic devices that could help enable the task. And that is from Delta Publishing. And our website, which is completely free, I think it has about 25 tasks on so far. Similar format, it has the instructions, it has all the authentic recordings and ideas for language feedback. That's fluencyfirst, ELT.com. Please sign up, and next time we update, you'll get a message.
I'm going to be updating soon. Yeah.
Yeah, it hasn't been updated for a while.
Yeah.
So now we'll take any questions. Henry, I wonder if you could.
Yeah, thanks everybody. I don't think we have too many questions in the Q&A. There were quite a few comments in the chat, but there weren't too many questions.
I'm okay with that.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's wonderful. I think you've answered everyone's questions in your session, so that's wonderful. Yeah, thanks so much for a great session. I think, you know, the focus on the task types and you know, the key for the task to be meaningful, focusing on the goal, and, you know, and the fluency fronted approach. I think that was a wonderful point, and then bringing that into the online space with Jamboard and so on. Fantastic. And I can really urge everyone to look at that Fluency First blog. I think it's wonderful. And just for the record, I hate ironing too, so that's all good. Thank you very much, Neil and Neil. And
Thank you.
with
Yes.
Thank you.